Welcome back, everyone, to Tsunami is Coming, the What Keeps Me Up at Night edition. My guest today is a good friend and a dear colleague from HEC Paris, Professor Anastasia Buyalskaya, Professor of Marketing. Anastasia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's a pleasure.
So, Anastasia, to you and like to all of my other guests, my first question, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, so thankfully, no longer my kids, so they're sleeping through the night now. So I think what keeps me up at night really, and just for a bit of context, I'm a behavioral scientist. So I spend about 90% of my time thinking about things like behavioral biases and why do people make decisions that they regret or that are suboptimal in all sorts of ways. And one thing that's a prerequisite for recognizing bias is what we call metacognition. So thinking about your own thinking, having some insight about your own thinking. And I worry that we are increasingly losing that. I was looking back at Wall-E. Have you seen Wall-E, Jeremy?
Yeah.
Yes, almost 20 years now. I can't quite believe it. I remember first seeing Wall-E and thinking it was so funny, and now it's so scary to me because you read the description of Wall-E and it's sort of, humans no longer use their bodies, they're tied to technology, they have no more, critical thinking left, and you think, wow, that's starting to feel like it's not that far away.
Almost predictive of a form of future, at least metaphorically. What's interesting about Wall-E is that at some point you even start to imagine this robot having its own form of emotions, right? Is that our future, or is that the risk that we're talking about?
Yeah, or that we're already there, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting in behavioral science, so there's like hundreds of biases out there, and we like to track sometimes if a bias is kind of less important or more important. And one of the, I would say, top three biases is confirmation bias, which which is the idea that people seek out information which is more likely to support their pre-existing beliefs, or you and I might have the same piece of information, but we interpret it differently depending on our beliefs. And so, Jeremy, what do you think? Is confirmation bias increasing or decreasing?
I'm almost sure it is increasing if I judge what's happening around us.
It's got to be, right? And
Yeah.
you think about news consumption and we've got colleagues that are more expert on this than me, but the fact that most of our news is now algorithmically mediated and you and I see different types of news because I see the stuff that is similar to the stuff I've liked in the past and you see the stuff that is similar to stuff you've liked in the past and I have no idea that maybe the stuff that I see is not only not a random sample, right? We're not seeing random samples of information anymore, but highly curated to be things that I like and I'm going to keep clicking on. And now we've got AI and all this research coming out saying that AI is very sycophantic and more likely to show us the stuff that we like. And every time I ask AI a question, I don't know what your experience has been. It's always like, this is such a great question, Anastasia. You are God's gift to the world, and please ask, so many good questions. And you just think, wow, confirmation bias, there's just no way it's going down.
Is there any way out of this? Because I remember, in the early years of my doctorate, I was trained by someone who had actually introduced me to the whole idea of political polarization at the time. The very first person to have even mentioned this to me. We're talking about the mid 2000s. We've been talking about this for a little while, 2 decades. Is there any way out of this? And the way we train people and the way we help people think through this?
It's a good question. I think a lot of people are trying to answer that question. I think part of it is going back to this metacognition, is knowing that those tools behave in a certain way and then knowing how to interact with them. So my understanding is that there's a big field now called prompt engineering, which is how do you actually interact with the AI? So if I know it's going to be sycophantic, I can tell it to say, I need you to be really critical, play the devil's advocate, and tell me why actually this research idea is a bad idea, why it's already been done, why there is no kind of contribution to this idea. So I think that's part of it. I think the second part is sort of not turning into Wall-E, like getting out and moving around and talking to people in real life, having conversations like this. It's funny. I'm sure you've got older members in your family that would just talk to strangers. I remember thinking that was so strange when I was little, and now I'm that person. I just any opportunity I can get, at the bakery, whatever it is, I just strike up a conversation because I think we're missing that so much now.
So, I mean, I hear you on both levels, thinking against yourself, the devil's advocate, without a doubt. And if you use AI tools correctly, they can be very, very powerful from that standpoint, but you have to train them. Speaking to strangers, what we're taught as children not to do.
I
And,
don't
and
recommend it to children, to be clear, just adults.
exactly. And I'm sure you've seen these stories as well of kids who basically were taught not to speak to anyone, and even when they needed help, they were afraid not to talk to anyone. When you've basically been around a kid, that kid knows how to recognize a mom, knows how to recognize someone in uniform, a fireman or a policeman, or whoever could actually help and actually stay in trouble or isolated more than they should, right? So that goes counter to whatever we were taught, right? It goes counter to the feeling of the moment that I guess we alluded to this tribalism. What's the right channel here? Is it the way we educate young children? Is it the way we train talents? Is this the way we accompany, the senior executives? What's the right channel? How we achieve that goal?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the formal institutions or any sort of institution that can facilitate a kind of conversation is definitely a good starting point. I mean, you and I teach at HEC Paris. We've got students in the classroom from all over the world, and some of them have very, very different views. And what better place than, sort of a safe classroom where there is a guide, right? As a teacher, we can kind of guide the conversation and say, you're right, and you're both right. And this issue is so complicated, and we need to understand where you're both coming from. I do think those institutions have an even more important role to play. I've heard some tech leaders saying, actually, college is not important anymore. You should just skip college and go straight from high school and join my AI company. And I couldn't disagree more.
Mm,
I think university, you're finally at a stage where you are forming your own opinions about the world, and to have a place to interact with people that have different opinions and learn how to do that in a respectful, intelligent way before we enter the working world. I just think that's going to be more important than ever, especially with
mm.
with AI taking over.
And especially getting them to think about how they think. Yeah. Two last questions. First, on that very point, I think I mean, this is a very talented generation, Gen Z. A lot of the
Hmm.
senior executives I meet want to know everything about Gen Z a little bit like they would want to know about foreign aliens, or anyway, repeating the same phrase twice, but aliens invading Earth, Gen Z is coming after us and so on. They're very talented, but somewhat impatient and sometimes thinking to themselves, why do I think about how I am thinking? I want to get down to business. Is that something you've seen too? That impatience, maybe something you have to think about to get them to choose another path, I guess.
You know what's funny? I have a lot of Gen Z students, and I've been so impressed with my students. I think they're so smart, and they've got such high critical thinking. And I'm always skeptical of this kind of, this generation is different. I remember this with millennials. I'm kind of an old millennial, and I remember there were so many consulting firms that were paid to kind of figure out millennials for companies.
Mm,
And you just think, I'm not sure that it's a new generation as much as it is the time in your life. I think when you're in your early 20s, you're entering the working world, I think we're all righteous in different ways, right? And we're righteous about the workforce, and we're righteous about the environment, and different things, and we express it in different ways. And of course the technology shifts, right? You and I were probably some of the first members of Facebook.
yeah.
And these guys are, way ahead on other technologies. But I think that if they're given the right incentives and they're given the right structures, I haven't seen an issue with things like patience or critical thinking. But I do think they need the structural support, and there's a lot of work to be done on fixing some of that structure.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. A question of timing in life, and I guess a question of context too. I mean, when
Hmm.
we were younger, maybe there wasn't this urgency around climate. Maybe there should have been, but maybe less so. And we weren't facing, this. I mean, there was the internet, but I don't think the internet resembled in any way the type of wave we're seeing with artificial intelligence. I'm tempted, and I'll end here to ask you. I am tempted to build a bridge between everything you said about the mistakes we make, the regrets we have making those mistakes, and so on. Building a bridge between that point and the question of leadership. I mean, we're going through a period where, without any political judgment on anything, I think it's fair to say there is a form of popular discontent across a wide range of countries out there, right? About leaders sometimes belonging to the political class, sometimes belonging to business. Is there a bridge to be built here in terms of our confirmation bias is growing and maybe that discontent. Can we basically look at it through that lens too, do you think?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, all at the same time, I think the world is more interesting for people to take a leadership position and sort of the hardest it's probably ever been to take a leadership position, partly because we're all increasingly living in these parallel realities. And so as a leader, how do you unite people? How do you make sure that your vision speaks to people that have very different sets of interests that may be, following different influencers or news sites or whatever it is? And at the same time, have the political will to make tough decisions. I think
Hmm.
there's some really important issues in terms of kind of fiscal, in terms of environment, that that we really need leadership to come in and make some of those tough decisions rather than feed kind of rhetoric that feels good in the short term, but is not actually fixing any of those long-term problems. But I agree, I think it's all connected.
Yeah, and it's fairly easy to be the leader of your tribe when everyone agrees and is already convinced by what you're saying, and
Right.
being the leader of a bigger group to unite.
Yeah.
Anastasia, this was fascinating as always. I'm just glad this time I could share it with other people, so thank you so, so much for joining me,
Always a pleasure to speak with you, Jeremy. Thank
and
you.
I hope you come again.
Will do. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.